this time we're going to be having Mr. Ismail, and he'll be speaking on the urgency of now and how to build and sustain the next generation for action-oriented leadership. So it's a great place to really have him, and it's a doctor. So we'll be sending him the link right away. We will begin. Okay, so thank you so much everyone for being supportive, and I hope that this is going to be blessing us, and we're going to have more speakers in this year. And as I've always said, our topics will be around people, and so as to do with dealing with people, I have to deal with people, and I have to live with people. So okay, so that is it. So I'm going to send him the link right away, and then we will go into begin. Okay, good. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much. Okay, good. So you just joined us now. Good. Thank you so much, sir. So adding him right away. Okay, good. I'm unable to add him. Okay, I'm unable to add you. Okay. I don't know why it's like that, but I'm unable to add him. Okay, let me see once again. Let me see if I'm able to add him. Doctor, I'm unable to add you. It's not showing that I can add you here. I don't know why. Maybe you're using a system or an iPad. I don't know. It's not allowing me to add you from here. Okay, let me see. Okay. Okay. I don't know why it's not allowing me to add you. Let me see. Okay, good. Okay, very good. Okay. So.
Hey,
Good.
brother, how are you?
I'm doing well. Is it good morning or good afternoon over there?
It's afternoon. It's afternoon.
Good afternoon. I want to say a very big thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to have you here. You know, I've gone through your profile and I realized that, okay, I think Africa still has hope that we have generations that actually have leadership in them, you know, and I'm really grateful for having you here. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me.
So, without wasting too much of the time, Doctor will be speaking on the urgency of now and how to build and sustain the next generation of action-oriented leadership. And I'm going to let him start speaking now. And after that, we have opened the floor for questions. Okay, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
No, thank you so much, first of all, for having me. I think it's an honor. And what you're doing is important. I think we're only as important as the platforms that we're afforded to speak. And I almost want to call it meeting under the tree, because as Africans, a lot of wisdom, a lot of conversations, a lot of really important subject matters that we've talked about for generations, for centuries, used to happen underneath big trees that brought people together. And now we're just in a virtual world where we use mediums like Instagram Live, but I think it's the same ethos of wherever we're in a moment of time that could dictate what the next 100 years is. It requires some very bold and courageous conversations, right? And that's why when you reached out, I'm like, okay, if you look at my professional background, some people may not know, I've spent half of my life outside of the continent. I was born in Gambia, but lived most of my life in the United States, work as professionally in the typical corporate route. But it was something about the continent once I got old enough and started realizing what was happening on the continent, it sparked something in me. And I'll tell you why. Majority of Africa, you take Ethiopia and set it to the side because they've never been colonized. Majority of Africa is under, as countries as we know it, the concept of Africa with different countries is less than 70 years old. For the most part, most people started getting their independence towards the late 50s, early 60s, mid 60s. So as a continent, we're extremely young. And I feel like so much of our conversations when we talk about Africa, I think as young people, and I use the word young loosely because Africa is one of the few places where I say this jokingly, but you could be 35, you could be 40 with a wife and 4 kids, and you're still considered young, right? But the juxtaposition of that too is only 1 out of 3 African men, for example, live past 65 years old. So if you think about it, we're calling young up until your 40s, but you're not living to be 70 years old. So it's a very interesting dynamic that I think we fail to realize how that impacts growth and development. Because if you are not given an opportunity to lead, to create, to inspire change until you're 50, 2 things happen. Either you're going to only have a 10-year run, and if you die early because for health reasons and things of that nature, or you repeat the same cycle of having 80-year-old people, 90-year-old people who should be our elders sitting underneath, but allowing us to run, still leading us with 1970 ideas when the world is thinking about what would the world look like 40, 50 years from now. And that to me is the core of the urgency of now. And when I say Africans, one of the things I'm very intentional about as I speak is I consider any Black person around the world of African origin. So when I speak of Africans, I mean every Black person who has a right to build Africa. And not only the country that you're from, I'm Gambian, but I consider the entire continent my playing ground because most countries, if I showed up in Lagos, which I have plenty of times now, and just close my mouth, nobody sees me and thinks, you might not be Nigerian, right? You're just African. And that's the beauty about the moment in Africa that we're in right now. I could drop you in Gambia right now, and there's nothing that identifies you as other than. And I think most of my really good relationships that I have with even African Americans are realizing that when I'm on the continent of Africa, nobody sees what I am anymore. All they see is you belong. Where even if you look at it from a cultural perspective, I forget I'm Black until I come back to the USA, and then every time I come back, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm Black again. Because I've been spending so much time in Africa over the past 3 years, where the identity of color disappears because I see myself as being able to relate to my Nigerian brothers, being able to relate to my Ghanaian brothers, being able to relate to my Ethiopian brothers, because there's a sense of ownership that we have. So when I speak of the urgency of now, what does that mean? I tell people all the time, as young people, we're impatient about where we think Africa should go, but that impatience is warranted because we've been disenfranchised for so long in terms of access to leadership, access to capital, access to agency, women being underrepresented in a lot of places of leadership, right? There's a lot of communities that are disenfranchised in Africa. The struggles that we've had with tribal issues, with cultural issues, with religious issues, there's a level of impatience. But at the same time, I always tell people, going back to where I began, if majority of Africa, this concept of Africa of multiple countries, which I have a very uncomfortable relationship with, because I think it's limiting. I feel like a Gambian should walk into Nigeria and feel like home. I feel like a Nigerian should have access to Gambia equally. So we've lost half the battle because even as Africans, we feel like when you have to travel and set up a business in Gambia, they see you as somebody else. But on the flip side, most non-Africans or non-Black people have unlimited access to the entire continent without the restrictions that we have internally. I think that's a responsibility for us as leaders to reshape that. Maybe the next 100 years, the idea of being Black, the idea of African, it's uniform, meaning the entire continent becomes your playground. But when it comes to the urgency of now, 2 things: value creation, wealth creation, and action-oriented leadership, right? And what does that actually mean for a lot of people? I tell individuals two things are going to happen over the next 100 years. Economically, Africa is positioned by every measure that you could think of to be an economic superpower over the next 100 years because we're going to be the most populous country. There's not a single natural resource that we cannot find in Africa. For God's sake, there's the rocks that create electricity that people just found a couple of weeks ago, right? And then Africa is young. Most people don't realize that majority of Africans have not celebrated their 25th birthday yet. So think about from a business standpoint what that means. Meaning if you have a product service that somebody who is 20 years old needs, you could maintain that person as a client, as a customer for over 50 years, right? Africa is extremely young, meaning also we're malleable, meaning we could reshape and redefine what leadership means to you, what leadership means to me, and not wait for permission to do it, but just do it unapologetically, but at a level where it's of global standard, but we're building our country, right? And I'll give you a prime example in terms of technology. Nigeria, 1960 is when they got their independence. Gambia 5 years later, right? At 70 years old and Gambia at 65 years old, we are far ahead in terms of opportunity, development, and talent than countries like the United States that's 400 years. So just think about it, if you could go back in time when the USA was 70 years old and see how much of an advantage we truly have. And not only that, the world has become global in the sense that people like me, for example, I'm 37 years old. I've spent close to almost over 20 years of my life as the USA. I consider USA a country of mine, but I also have the cultural awareness, the nuance to be able to exist on every African country. And every skill set that I've accumulated, harnessed, grown, there's direct opportunity to apply it in Africa and lead without waiting, trying to go into politics or do a lot of things. So most of the challenges that we have in Africa, there's Black people around the world that could solve our problems. And I think that has to be a shift, because so many times, if you look at a lot of ills on the continent, right, we commoditize problems as a way of getting somebody to help us. If you look at the psychology of even leadership within our countries, if electricity is a problem, they'll spend more time commoditizing the fact to the world that, oh, we don't have light. Please give us money or funding or grants. So we commoditize problems. And what that does is, if a group of young Black people find a solution to fix it, the system has no incentive for the problem to go away. Because once again, the problem was the commodity. Think about it from a hunger standpoint, think about it from a healthcare standpoint, right? If we did not have something to ask for or beg for, then what's a major source of funding and help disappears, right? And that's very critical, because if you look at a lot of countries, nothing in this world is free. And nobody is coming to really save us. And I say that oftentimes because all of our problems, from food, electricity, education, healthcare, anybody who gives you something, is business, right? There's something in return that you're always going to be indebted for. And what that does is you make a lot of decisions, a lot of deals that you're hurting the future generation who you've sold their ownership and agency before they actually were at the point where they could actualize things that they want to do, right? So the urgency now is, okay, what should the generation of young Black people, and I would say as soon as you're 18 up until you're 55 years old, what decisions and actions are we going to take that are intentional about building the Africa we want, independent of influence, right? And most of the times I think about four things, and I've talked about the 4 C's that I think are necessary for us to do it. But for the audience, I'm always going to remind it, because as I've traveled and met individuals like you, individuals who I automatically consider could be part of the building blocks of the next Africa, I tend to see a lot of 4 characteristics that I think they're important, right? The first one is like, do we actually love our continent more than we love our interests? There's something, and I'll use healthcare as an example. A lot of people with my healthcare company, InnovaX Global, they wonder why so much passion in terms of what the quality of services that I provide. I'm like, at the end of the day, every patient could be my grandmother. Every patient could be my mother. Every patient could be my aunt, uncle. So I'm doing things from a place of human connection because I know the alternative to it, right? But the biggest thing is like, do we really love our continent? And compatriotism, oftentimes we assign it to one country. It's really not. I think the idea of compatriotism is, do you love the people who are in your community, in your environment, that look like you, where you're willing to use the limited amount of time that you have on earth to make it slightly better than what you found it? And most people that are at the precipice of building the next generation Africa, they automatically love this idea of an Africa that can be something versus what it is now that we're frustrated about. So that's one key element, right? The second element is capability. One of the biggest things in Africa, and especially now where there's a plethora of entrepreneurs, there's a lot of people with intentions, a lot of people don't have the patience to make sure they build the capacity to execute before they are given an opportunity to execute. That's why even a lot of our governments, a lot of our organizations, there's a level of frustration because if people don't have the capacity that is current, because capacity of 50 years ago is different from capacity of 2023, right? But as a continent, I don't think we police capacity the way we should, because we're also not honest with each other. Where if I see your resume, I'm like, you want to start building cars, but you haven't taken one class of mechanical engineering in your life, you should not have access to be able to do certain things. And what is happening is we're exporting African capacity. At the end of the day, if you look at the most talented Black people in the world with the greatest minds, Africa is not a conducive enough environment yet for them to transfer the wealth of knowledge. So the biggest export in a lot of our talented areas is minds, and capacity is what we export. If you come to the USA, the most Black doctors are of African origin, right? The nursing field, just think about the brain drain. It's a capacity export. And I think having a sense of urgency of what needs to happen is, how do we reverse that trend and start bringing back the capacity? That way now, every pivotal position in Africa is filled by somebody who is capable. I think that is fundamentally important because, one, you got to love nation. You want to love continent. You want to love your people. But you could love people, but if you don't have the capacity, you have to have the discipline to go and build it. It's the 10,000 hours that I talk about. Are you a student of your craft? If leadership, is it business? Is it science? Are you building up the capacity where now when you stand across from your fellow African, and we know this is true, because typically if a white person with the same degree as I have stands across one African, intuitively and psychologically for generations and generations, we've seen anything that is non-Black as quality, because we just assume that capacity and capability of a Black mind does not belong on the continent. And there are companies and corporate structures that pay a lot to it. So psychologically, it's even harder if you're somebody who's capable to convince a fellow African that you are capable to execute, because our ecosystem is flooded with a lot of fool's gold, and it hurts us, right? So capacity is extremely important. The next thing is credibility. Most people, and you tell when you talk about the effects of corruption in Africa, credibility is like so critical for the next generation of leaders to have, where it should be non-negotiable. Because so many times, if you see things that don't work in Africa across every single field, sometimes you have the most capable human beings who are the least credible human beings, right? And that's also an effect that a lot of the leaders that you see right now, they could be extremely capable. But the moment you start zooming into their character, start zooming into their propensity to make certain deals that are morally not in line with the benefit of Africa, it doesn't work. And I always tell people, you could be the most capable human being, but if you lack credibility, you cannot be in a position where you could impact change that is lasting, because sooner or later, every human being will see your true colors. They say no matter how long a tree is in a river, it could never turn into an alligator. And if it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's not a mongoose. People are going to see through it, right? So a lot of the action-oriented leadership, most places, even if you notice trends and things that are working in Africa, and I think there's a lot of success stories in Africa, be it people leading organizations that are successful, countries that people tend to see are moving fast enough. There's an aura of credibility that's combined with capability that makes these places move. And I think most people, if they just truly pay attention, let's say leadership, because any leadership is the reflection of the people, be it a country, be it an organization, be it a society, our leaders are always going to be a reflection of us. The day Africa could combine and harness credibility, capability, and love of nation, you transform Africa faster than any continent has ever had the ability to do it. Because once again, we're blessed with resources, both human resources, natural resources, where it doesn't take a long time to transform nations. And as a Gambian, I always use Senegal as an example, because they are our noisy neighbors, as we call them, but we're one people, right? And even if anybody who sees Gambia and Senegal, that's the biggest tragedy that colonialism did, because it's one people. Like, it's one language, same tribes, but it's different. But 10 years ago, if you went to Senegal and you go back to Senegal today, you almost don't recognize the country. So even right now, they're listed as the fastest growing economy in Africa. There's a lot of countries where it stems, if you peel the layers of it, those three things are key. They love country, love Africa. They're recruiting and filling all the seats that are important with highly capable people. And you know what's beautiful about our capability, our brand of capability? If you take a capable Black person of African origin, they could sit in any boardroom in the world and command respect, because the same thing that they were paying for is the same thing that they recognize. It's almost like a superpower. So every young professional who's done some tremendous success in like the corporate structures of Europe, corporate structures of USA, the moment we plan your ingenuity in Africa, that capability becomes a world brand, but that's rooted in Africa, right? So those three things, very important. The last one is just courage. And I love talking about courage because if I take my journey, for example, right? A lot of people have been curious about, my story is known. I worked as a pharmacist in corporate America, had a relatively successful, based on what is defined as a successful career in the USA. And then I quit my job about 4 years ago now and started a healthcare company in Africa, which most sane people will tell you don't do it. Sometimes I even tell people don't do it because I know the toll it takes. But there's a level of courage that is required from a leadership standpoint where Africa is flooded with bad regulations, bad policies, bad ideas that we just conform to, not knowing that it's slowing our continent back, right? But what you're seeing now, there's a brand of young African who is courageous because they know they're capable. They love the continent in a way that they really want to give back. And what really holds a lot of people back is, one, how difficult or challenging the road might be, what other people may think, the level of comfort that you'll have to give up in order to participate in leadership from an action standpoint, where it's not planning. One thing any African country has is we have a lot of plans. We are good at proposals, project documentation, workshops, international treaties. But when it comes to let's execute, the room gets thinner. And a lot of that, it's based on courage. How much courage do you have to believe in something so much that you know you are highly capable of doing and making a decision to participate in Africa from a value creation standpoint and a wealth creation standpoint? Because what's also happening in Africa, like there's not a secret why there's not a single continent that is not planting interests in the continent, right? And I have nothing wrong with that because we live in a capitalist society. Anywhere that people find value in and see the opportunity, they are going to invest now so that later on, by the time people wake up and realize that this is an opportunity or economic gold mine, the battle has been lost. So any Black person in the world, I'll be the first one to tell you professionally, if your roadmap does not include a wealth creation and value creation opportunity in Africa, your kids are going to have to buy things from a place that you came from. Because if you look at economies like China, less than 50, 100 years, China wasn't what it is today. And once again, because colonialism held Africa back so much, I think the next 30 years of Africa is going to define the next 200 years of Africa. I really do believe that, because every economy, every sector, you're at the precipice of becoming what Africa is going to be 200 years ago. So if you have the capacity, if you have the credibility, and you choose not to participate, you would have missed an opportunity to be one of the Rockefellers of Africa, one of the Henry Fords of Africa, right? All these people that were at the precipice of building the United States, for example, who now their great-grandkids have amassed so much value and wealth that is indestructible. But if you look at African countries, how many places in Africa can you find fourth generation value creation, fourth generation wealth creation? It's not common, right? So there's a big opportunity from a leadership standpoint. And I tell people, leadership is not about you running a company that you hire people. And I think that's a misconception. There's two things about leadership that I always like to mention. One, you could never lead people without leading yourself. Meaning, as a human being, you must always have a map, meaning this is where I want to go, this is how I want to navigate it. But in your back pocket, you should always have a mirror. And this is not a concept that I've created. The first person I heard talk about it was Vusi Tembekwayo. I don't know if you know about Vusi. He's a South African businessman, tremendous public speaker. He talked about the concept of a map and a mirror. The map meaning, as a human being, you should always know where you want to go. Who do you want to emulate? What career path did you want to go down with? If you put your map in the front pocket, your back pocket should always have a mirror, because that's your accountability piece. That is your self-awareness, being honest with yourself. Am I capable enough to do what I'm doing? Am I credible enough to do what you're doing? So leadership starts there. Are you leading yourself first using the map and mirror concept before you could step in to even hope that people follow you? But the second thing too is, like, you don't need permission to lead as well too. Because if you lead yourself individually, you could never have a room where there's too many chiefs but not enough Indians. I think we're at a point where you could always align your leadership, your vision with somebody else's vision. And because you're so good at leading yourself from an action-oriented and accountability standpoint, there's an immediate transfer of value and we see each other, right? And that's the most critical thing. The same way, that's why I get excited, because I'll be honest, for the first 30 years of my life, I did not engage with young African professionals from outside the confines of Gambia like I should have, right? And now that I've been traveling across Africa so much, it's mind-blowing how beautiful our tapestry is in terms of diversity, but how common our experience is, because the same way when I'm in Lagos, the same way I'm in Addis Ababa, there's a hunger, the same way in Accra, there's a hunger that our generation has to build something, because we know we could compete at a global level. And not only compete, we could dominate at a global level. We really can, because we dominate. I mean, we're raised to dominate. The typical African experience, you're raised with a level of desperation where second is never good enough. You know, it's the running joke, be a lawyer, doctor, or engineer. That's what your parents want you to be. That's rooted just in be something that is respectable and at the top of the food chain. That has to evolve now, where it could arts, music, politics, economics. It doesn't just have to be those three, but at the root of that is we are excellent people and there's an expectation of excellence that should be non-negotiable, right? But that has been happening successfully over the past couple of decades. The continent just hasn't benefited from it because, once again, our biggest export, I don't think it's gold. I don't think it's diamond. I don't think it's copper. I don't think it's coltan. I don't think it's, you name it, it's our intellectual capacity. That's been the most lucrative and infinite export that the continent has been doing for so many years. And it's going to take a moment where there's a sense of urgency. And urgency means, listen, we will have to answer questions to our children when they grow up, and they were going to ask every single one of us, Baba, Mommy, whatever language, where were you at that time? And what did you choose to do or not do? Every generation are going to ask those questions, and they're going to be really hard questions, because the same way our generation could look at some of our elders and there's a level of frustration, there's a level of apathy, there's a level of sometimes even resentment, because you look at them like, how did we not participate in all of these things? And why has you guys not created a succession plan where, as we mature, like a lot of societies, into our 30s, late 20s, there's an immediate transition of power and control and leadership where we could guide and build a future that we are going to participate in and our kids are going to participate in. Because the honest reality is, any person, and I don't ever want to look like ageism is something that I focus too much on, because I really don't believe in. I believe in credibility and capacity, not age, because you could be young and not credible. But if you look at a race, if somebody has 20 years of running left and somebody else has 40 years of running left, naturally it's important for whoever has 20 years to stop running and tell the younger able person all the running techniques to not do. That way, the next 30 years of running, they are going to break barriers. Until that happens, things are just going to be harder to do, but not impossible to do, right? And that's where the sense of urgency comes into play. I think it's a beautiful place that we're in right now, because it's an opportunity. There's one mental switch that we have to take. Stop seeing our problems as problems, seeing it as opportunity. Any problem in Africa, and you know we're good at this, most Black people, African people, are good at telling you everything that's wrong with the country, everything that's wrong with the government, everything. But the moment you ask them, okay, solution time, what do you want to be a part of when it comes to solutions? Then there's a blankness to it, where, because psychologically, we've been trained to mortgage away the responsibility of a lot of things in our life to somebody else who's most of the times older and a man. So psychologically, we've been trained for years to think that any decision that you make has to be influenced by either your religious leader or the male figure in your house. So most Africans, if you look at how we're raised, we're not raised to take ownership in the decisions we make and the choices that we make. So it's hard to make that switch from like, okay, I'm just going to wait till what our imam or pastor says, I'm going to live accordingly, or what my dad says, and that's what I'm going to live accordingly, right? So when you put them in a position like, no, what are you going to do? Now that you're old enough, right? And it's funny because the scripture always tells us once you're old enough to know better, you're supposed to do better and let go of the childish ways. That's literally in a lot of the teachings, right? But it's like, how do we re-engineer ourselves to know that once you have information and you have the courage to do it, you need to start acting and taking ownership for how people's experiences are, and stop playing games about what being victims of our circumstance. All those things don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. The biggest thing is like, now is a beautiful time to have access to things like Chat GPT, artificial intelligence, YouTube, like where there's nothing information-wise that you cannot learn. So the urgency of now, at the end of the day, just to kind of wrap up and allow for questions, is we are at a golden age, and we're at the precipice of shaping what Africa and the world is going to look like 100 years from now, 200 years from now. The number one question we all have to ask ourselves is, are we ready or courageous enough to not only participate, but willfully lead ourselves first, and by virtue of leading ourselves, transition to leading the next generation of leaders, young people, because they're watching. The same way we're watching our elders, our kids are also going to be watching. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mr. Ismail. I'm really grateful. I want to say a very big thank you. I feel like you really, I want to find the right word to you. You really broke down this topic, and I think this is a topic that we're actually experiencing now, which I feel the topic is actually very important right now. So there's a question I want to ask, which I think it's very necessary, especially for such a time as this, where we find ourselves in Africa. And the question is this: how do we address the issue of competency over familiarity? And I want to explain that. So let's say we find ourselves in an organization where we have people having to compete for a position that needs competency, but then the minority also wants to contest for that position, but because of they not have the numbers to actually acquire the vote, and the other person who has numbers but they don't have the competency, they rather choose the one who has numbers but doesn't have the competency, which is so glaring and obvious enough. But they rather choose to follow familiarity because of, oh, it's from my place, I know him. How do people who have competency address issues like this, especially when it comes to the fact that they won't make impact, but at the same time they're restricted by issues like this?
I think one is, and you could almost close your eyes and put this problem in almost every African country, right?
Yeah.
Even sometimes the way we choose our leaders, we could literally look at the most capable person in the room and say like, oh, he belongs to this tribe, or he's from this village. It's not going to work because it's like an idea of majority. But I think part of it too is, and I think there's a brand of honest leadership that doesn't ask for permission that is happening on the continent that needs to keep happening, because I feel like we need to start documenting all the things that could go wrong if we make certain decisions while the decision is being made. Because most of the times, if we have the courage to say, okay, guys, this is where we want to go, as in this is the destination, right? You have two options. You give a driver who just got his permit license yesterday, but if you bypass this driver that's had 50, 60 years worth of experience, 2 years down the line, I'm also going to remind you that in this moment of time, this is the decision that you made, and you have to own it, right? And I think that's where young people have a voice where it's not rebellious. And anytime you think rebellious, people think it's violence. No, but it's more defiance, and there's authenticity in our courage where we're going to document the decisions that we make now and be very vocal about making the right decisions based on competency, where we're going to hold you accountable for it. Because the reality is, a lot of times when these bad decisions are being made in organizations and countries, it's not properly documented in terms of what the decision-making process was, who influenced the decision-making process. That way, if it goes good or bad, if it goes bad, credit goes to who it belongs to. But if it goes south, history has to be written to document individuals who, in the moment of choice, they chose familiarity over competency, right? And most of the times there's going to be a price to pay. It could be failures of projects, catastrophes in terms of organizations. But because it was documented, I think the next time the opportunity comes and people know that I am not going to get away with these decisions that I'm making for the future generation, and my entire family name will have to bear the burden of this decision, that's society's way of holding you accountable. Because oftentimes with leadership, most leaders act from a position that the average person does not care enough to learn about what's going on. And to a certain extent, that's true. Even in terms of politics, the average citizenry doesn't understand the implications of a lot of policies, because the decision makers are almost betting on the fact that you're going to be dealing with an uneducated society, right? So the first thing you want, if you want to control any society, make sure they're ill-informed. But the counter to that is the competent people has to be very intentional about informing individuals about the repercussions of our actions that may not be reversible for maybe up to 50 years down the line. And that's always a good place to start, is just being honest and transparent about what could go wrong, to kind of make it harder for people to see all the evidence in front of them and choose to go left.
Wow. Thank you so much. Okay, so the last question before we leave and before we let you go, the question is this. You know, I've been with young people, I've had relationship with young people, and they always want to justify. Somehow, I think it's in Africa. It's you find this very well in Africa where we somehow have a way of actually validating wrong decisions, and it's glaring. You know, this is wrong. If this your system of leadership is done bad to this, it's done bad. But we have a way of having to actually make even bad things look good, even when you know it's obviously wrong. So the question is, how should we measure a successful system of leadership, especially maybe in a school system, as a country? What do you think? What metrics should we use in judging or measuring a good or successful leadership?
Yeah, I think you have to run a lot of places like you're running a business from a metric standpoint. And what you do is you have to define and get agreements on the destination. It almost goes back to a map. Like even before you end back on doing it, there has to be agreements that even if it's time bound, as a leader, I could come and say, in 5 years, this is what I seek to accomplish. That way, everybody knows the destination before they get on the bus. Because what that does is once those metrics, measurements of success, and the beauty is you don't have to conquer everything. It's a relay. You could see that, okay, in my 5 years or 10 years that I have, these are the things that I want to accomplish that I may never live to see the fruits of that, or that legacy project will never bear my name. But this is a contract, because leadership is a social contract, right? At any level. You're saying that this is what I want to accomplish. And now once everybody is in the know, there's a social contract and an accountability structure where at every single point, you could reflect back to know in the beginning, this was the contract that we had, right? Not like these superficial things. Oh, I want to change healthcare. Oh, I want to, build X amount of schools. No, that's where we fall prey, because most leaders like legacy projects where they want to build a massive 500-bed hospital, but in their plan, they never told you how there's a shortage of doctors in that country, where there's shortage of medication in that country. So the hospital is nice. They show up, cut the ribbon, and then 5 years down the line, you go in oxygen. There's not even oxygen in the hospital, or there's a shortage of doctors. So part of it is writing metrics. And the funny thing is, like, most places have these things in place. They have developmental plans. They have national policy strategies. But because it's not known enough by a lot for it to be a social contract, it could be set aside. And over the years, it just turns into, whoever's at the seat, there's no sense of accountability. And I really do believe that, because today, and I'll say my example as an example, I have investors who invested in the company. If they woke up every single day and noticed that the company is not making revenue, we're not providing healthcare, we're not living up to our promise, I wouldn't be around. The same way our customers, if we tell them, get a subscription, this is what comes along with it. The moment there's a deviation in the social contract that is known, you're easily held accountable faster. And I think that has to be the core of how we build organizations, with clear intentions, but also measurable things, that the moment there's a deviation, somebody could bring you back to under the tree and tell you, you know what? You may not either be credible enough or capable enough. For the sake of this destination, we need you to set aside and bring somebody to the table, and hopefully a woman, because that's also another thing about leadership. Most organizations that increase their density of women leaders perform better. In Africa, we've been plagued by male leadership that hasn't worked since independence, where it's about time as well too that we set aside and allow capable women, because I think women are easily more credible from a leadership standpoint than men are. That may be an assumption of mine, but I'm yet to be proven wrong. But I think that's has to be part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful, honestly grateful, and I'm hoping that one day we'll probably have you in Nigeria, Lagos. Thank you so much. And if okay, I think I don't want this to be so long. So if you have any question, I could. Okay, maybe we can't give time for questions, but time is past. We want people to come back to watch this. Because something I think every young person should listen to, with the details information given. So I'm so grateful, Mr. Ismail, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I'm really grateful. Thank you so much. Okay.
No, I'm honored. Thank you as well too. We've been going back and forth with messages since last year. So it's truly an honor, and what you're doing is important. You're amplifying voices that matter, so I don't take it for granted. And yes, I'm glad. Hopefully, I'm in Lagos a lot, so I look forward to actually connecting with you.
That's good. That's good. Okay, thank you so much, sir.
All right. Excellent.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you everyone for joining. Bye.